It's Wednesday, the 10th September 2025. A quick look at some of the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. We begin with the Punch newspaper. The leading story says, doctors to decide on nationwide strike today. The complete story can be found on page 7 and 29 of the Punch newspaper. And above that story, no immediate plan to implement fuel surcharge, says federal government. The complete story can be found on page 24 of the Punch newspaper. 2027 presidency. Jonathan splits South-South PDP. The complete story can be found on page 2 of the Punch newspaper. 31 states domestic debt hits 2.57 trillion naira. The complete story can be found on page 23 of the Punch newspaper. NOPEC suspends strike as 𝐷𝐞𝐰𝐬𝐬𝐷 accepts union's demand. The complete story can be found on page 23 of the Punch newspaper. And below the leading story from the right, PDP SANS protests as Senate blocks Natasha's return. The complete story can be found on page 18 of the Punch newspaper. 5 soldiers, terrorists feared killed in Zamfara clash. The complete story can be found on page 18 of the Punch newspaper. Osun kingmakers reject move to dethrone jailed monarch. The complete story can be found on page 29 of the Punch newspaper. Vehicle theft. 3 Nigerians jailed 96 years in Ghana. The complete story can be found on page 4 and 5 of the Punch newspaper. South Africa dents Eagles World Cup hopes after stalemate. The complete story can be found on page 31 of the Punch newspaper. Moving over to Nigerian Tribune. The leading story says, suspension. Senate, Natasha in fresh drama. The complete story can be found on page 4 of the Nigerian Tribune. And above that story says, 𝐷𝐞𝐰𝐬𝐬𝐷, NOPEC reach agreement, strike called off. The complete story can be found on page 3 of the Nigerian Tribune. And below the leading story from the left, we won't tolerate power supply crisis in tertiary hospitals, says Tinubu. The complete story can be found on page 4 of the Nigerian Tribune. FIRS, EFCC strengthen alliance to enforce voluntary tax compliance. The complete story can be found on page 6 of the Nigerian Tribune. Experts blame low CNG penetration on high infrastructure costs, insufficient stations, others. The complete story can be found on page 3 of the Nigerian Tribune. In health, we have heart attacks may be triggered by infections, says studies. Complete story can be found on page 13 of the Nigerian Tribune. And beside that story says, Northern elders urge governors to negotiate with bandits. The complete story can be found on page 3 of the Nigerian Tribune. No plan for immediate implementation of 5% fuel tax, says Edun. The complete story can be found on page 6 of the Nigerian Tribune. Moving over to Vanguard, the leading story says, world leaders, envoys condemn Israel's attacks on Qatar. The complete story can be found on page 5 of the Vanguard. And above that story says, federal government gazette tax reform laws implementation begins January 2026. The complete story can be found on page 19 of the Vanguard. And below that story says, how kidnapped Major was rescued in Delta community. The complete story can be found on page 6 of the Vanguard. Gridlock as fresh floods take over Lagos roads, paralyze businesses. The complete story can be found on page 7 of the Vanguard. We will brand Nigeria as global coronary powerhouse, says 𝐀𝐟𝐫𝐢𝐬𝐴. The complete story can be found on page 15 of the Vanguard. And below the leading story from the right, new curriculum. Don't implement in hurry, expert tells federal government. The complete story can be found on page 10 of the Vanguard. 2027. More governors, senators Reps eager to join APC, says 𝐀𝐟𝐫𝐢𝐧𝐠. The complete story can be found on page 12 of the Vanguard. In sports, we have Eagles draw against Bafana, sad for Nigerian football. The complete story can be found on page 31 of the Vanguard. Tinubu's bold reforms, proof of political will in executing economic policy, says Vice President Shettima. The complete story can be found on page 9 of the Vanguard. NOPEC suspends strike after DSS brokered truce with Dangote. The complete story can be found on page 8 of the Vanguard. Expiration of suspension. PDP kicks as Senate denies Natasha's resumption. The complete story can be found on page 8 of the Vanguard. Moving over to Daily Trust. The leading story says, how flood swept away 2 sisters, others in Zaria. The complete story can be found on page 3 and 4 of the Daily Trust. And above that story from the left, we won't implement fuel tax now, says Oyedele. The complete story can be found on page 12 of the Daily Trust. Ways to recover funds sent to wrong account. The complete story can be found on page 33 on the Daily Trust. Why suicide is becoming common. The complete story can be found on page 5 of the Daily Trust. And below the leading story from the left, female accountant found dead in car in FCT. The complete story can be found on page 28 of the Daily Trust. Condemnation as Israel military hits Hamas leaders in Doha. The complete story can be found on page 32 of the Daily Trust. Nigeria's 2026 World Cup hopes uncertain after South Africa draw. The complete story can be found on page 38 of the Daily Trust. DSS resolve NOPEC, Dangote Group rift, strike suspended. The complete story can be found on page 31 of the Daily Trust. Moving over to the last paper on the list today, The Guardian. The leading story says, federal government under pressure as DMO blames FX, global shocks for rising debts. The complete story can be found on page 6 of The Guardian. And above that story says, NOPEC suspends strike as Dangote agrees to unionize workers. The complete story can be found on page 3 of The Guardian. Delta slashes dialysis costs, expand health reforms. The complete story can be found on page 29 of The Guardian. PDP, LP, others flay Senate's move to stop Natasha's resumption. The complete story can be found on page 3 of The Guardian. And below the leading story from the left, Nepal on edge as PM. Key ministers resign over alleged graft, social media ban. The complete story can be found on page 6 of The Guardian. Flight delays disruption. NCAA summons domestic airlines to Abuja. The complete story can be found on page 5 of The Guardian. Reps fume. Summon minister over Abuja Kaduna rail derailment. The complete story can be found on page 30 of The Guardian. No immediate plan to implement 5% fuel tax, says Edum, amid pushback for OPS CSOs. The complete story can be found on page 16 of The Guardian. Federal government overhauls social register to support over 70 million citizens. The complete story can be found on page 7 of The Guardian. And these are the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. If any of these headlines caught your attention, do get a copy of the paper to read the complete story.